Greetings to my dear guests on this video. I wish you a pleasant viewing and look forward to your feedback in the comments. They say in finance, you either learn to swim fast or get buried beneath spreadsheets and missed deadlines. I've been swimming for 16 years, fighting tides, navigating storms, and building a reputation as the one who never drops the ball, never complains, and never, ever needs a day off. Vacations? I'd forgotten what the word felt like. My name's Anastasia, and up until a few months ago, I believed my work ethic was my shield. Turns out it was a target. It all began on a gray Thursday morning, the kind where even the coffee tastes like compromise. I was 3 pages deep into a revised investment risk matrix when Gary, my manager, tapped on the edge of my glass-walled office. No knock, of course. Just that greasy salesman smile and a casual, "Got a minute?" I hated that smile. It was the one he used when delivering bad news wrapped in flattery. "Anastasia," he said, stepping in without waiting. "Meet Sam. He's fresh out of Cornell, top of his class in financial analytics. Bright kid, eager to learn. I want him shadowing you for a while." Sam stepped in behind him, all crisp suit and calculated charm. He extended a hand with a smile too wide for 8:15 a.m. "Pleasure to meet you," he said. His eyes scanned the office, my whiteboard, the stacked files, even the photograph of my dog on the shelf, like he was cataloging the kingdom he was about to inherit. "Shadowing?" I repeated, trying to keep my tone even. Gary nodded. "Just for a few weeks. Get him up to speed on your workflows, client models, all the essentials. Think of it as mentoring the next generation." Something in my stomach tightened. I didn't move. "Of course," I said after a beat. "Happy to help." Liar, I thought, but I smiled anyway. That's what you do when the trap's already been baited. Sam settled into the spare desk outside my office that same day. He brought nothing with him, no files, no laptop bag, just a corporate-issued ThinkPad and a hunger I could feel through the glass. For someone meant to be shadowing, he was awfully proactive. "Mind if I take a crack at the Avante portfolio analysis?" he asked barely an hour into his first day. I blinked. "You've seen the portfolio?" "Just glanced at it over your shoulder earlier," he said with a sheepish grin. Didn't mean to snoop. He had meant to. Every move he made was calculated. Every spreadsheet he opened. Every comment he made during our team syncs. And Gary? He played dumb, acted like Sam was just enthusiastic. But I saw the shift. Fewer meetings for me, more for Sam. My client updates slowly rerouted. Sam was sitting in more and more often. By the end of week 2, I realized I wasn't mentoring Sam. I was training him to take my place. The insult wasn't in the betrayal. It was in the assumption that I wouldn't notice. On Friday, Gary brought both of us into a meeting with our division director. I walked in, coffee in hand, to find Sam already seated, my report printouts in front of him. "We've been impressed," the director said, gesturing toward Sam. "He's picking things up quickly." Gary beamed. "Anastasia's a great teacher." I said nothing. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. That night, I stayed late. After everyone else had gone, I scrolled through internal comms, permissions, even access logs. Sam had been granted right access to accounts that were supposed to be senior only. He had my deck templates, my macros, my custom forecasting models. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the skyline, and something in me clicked into place. This wasn't just about being replaced. It was about being erased. But what Gary didn't know, what Sam would never guess, is that I have a little secret. I studied finance in Beijing, spent 2 years immersed in the language, the culture, and the boardroom etiquette of a system sharper than any Ivy League spreadsheet warrior could imagine. So when I overheard Gary laughing with the CEO over lunch one afternoon, in Mandarin, about how, once she finishes training him, we can fire her, I didn't flinch. I just smiled. Too bad no one told Gary that I speak fluent Mandarin. Let the game begin. By Monday morning, the dynamic had changed. Sam didn't hover awkwardly outside my office, like he did the first few days. He walked in like he owned the place, pulled up a chair, and asked if he could revisit the Zephyrum Holdings account, the same one I'd only briefly mentioned in passing during our onboarding session. "We haven't gotten to that one yet," I said, keeping my tone neutral. He smiled, a touch too smug. "Oh, I know, but I took the liberty of pulling some of the Q2 trends from last year, just to be ahead of the curve." My fingers froze above the keyboard. That file wasn't public. Access was restricted to senior analysts, and I'd never opened it on a shared drive while he was around. I nodded slowly. "Very proactive of you." "Thanks," he said, leaning back like we were colleagues. Equals. The next day, I caught him referencing a version of my proprietary risk model that I hadn't shared with anyone outside of leadership. My stomach turned, but I smiled like I was flattered. By Wednesday, Gary had stopped pretending this was a mentorship. He hovered around Sam's desk, dropped by my office more frequently, walked into our meetings with the kind of grin you wear when you think your plan is foolproof. "Anastasia," he said as he leaned against the frame of my door, "we'd love it if you could give Sam a little more responsibility this week. Maybe walk him through some of your logic for stress testing the hedge fund indexes." I forced a smile. "Of course. Anything to help the team?" He nodded like a proud parent and left. That's when I started documenting everything. I created a private log on my encrypted flash drive. Every odd access timestamp. Every file Sam opened that he shouldn't have known existed. Every comment Gary made that sounded like a half-buried warning. I didn't just track what was happening. I recorded tone, timing, expression. Context matters when you're building a case. I called it Operation Shadow. By the end of the second week, I had 26 entries. Sam kept asking pointed questions. Not beginner questions, but "I already know the answer. Let's see if you do" type questions. And Gary? He wasn't hiding anymore. He started dropping into our sessions uninvited, pretending to observe, but I could feel the scrutiny in every silence. Still, I played the part. I explained the firm's internal audit cycle. I outlined our high-yield portfolio rotation strategies. I even walked Sam through my forecast error margin tracking method, all with the calm of someone too naive to see what was happening. Inside, I was watching, calculating, recording. There was a moment, Thursday afternoon, when Sam leaned over my desk to ask a question about a compliance clause. His finger hovered above the line before he said, "This is the version before the July revision, right?" I didn't react, but I hadn't shared that revision. I hadn't even opened that contract in front of him. He knew, and I knew, in that moment, that he'd been prepped. Not by chance, not by ambition, but intentionally. Someone had been feeding him everything. Gary. It wasn't about performance. It wasn't even about budget. It was about politics, optics, a new face to replace the one that had become too competent, too independent. I left work that night, the skyline glowing over the river, and sat on the subway with my earbuds in, no music playing. Just the low hum of the train and the slow throb of adrenaline in my chest. They thought I was training my replacement, but I wasn't just handing over data. I was collecting ammunition. I wasn't going to warn them. I wasn't going to ask questions. I was going to wait, because the most dangerous kind of woman isn't the one who screams, it's the one who smiles and keeps the receipts. Corporate dinners were my least favorite form of torture. They were slow, padded with small talk, and filled with people pretending not to count every second until dessert. Still, I attended everyone. That's what you do when you're the senior financial analyst and your presence is appreciated, but not quite expected. You become the background, the wallpaper, essential but invisible. This dinner was different. The invitation had come 3 days earlier, slipped into my inbox with a subject line so flowery, I thought it was a phishing scam at first. Honoring global synergy, welcoming CEO Zhang to our NY division. I knew Zhang's name the moment I saw it. His reputation preceded him, shrewd, composed, and quietly ruthless. He didn't waste words or time. If he was coming from Shanghai, it wasn't for pleasantries. It meant change. The venue was a rooftop lounge in Manhattan's financial district, with sweeping views of the skyline and enough expensive wine to lubricate Betrayal. I arrived 5 minutes early, as always. The air was cool, the night clear. My black dress was simple, sharp, no jewelry, nothing that jingled. Gary spotted me the moment I stepped off the elevator. "Glad you could make it," he said, brushing his hand briefly against my shoulder in a way I hated. "You invited me," I replied, cool and polite. He laughed like we were friends. "Yeah, but you know how these things are. Names get thrown around, priorities shift." That was his way of saying I was lucky to be here. I smiled and drifted toward the bar. The room was full of laughter, curated introductions, and conversations about strategy that meant nothing. I stood near the edge, drink in hand, offering nods when needed, but mostly listening. Always listening. Mr. Jang arrived 15 minutes late. Not fashionably, deliberately. Every movement was precise. He shook only a few hands, gave only one short speech in Mandarin, and then sat down to eat. His accent was Beijing standard, clean, deliberate. I hadn't spoken that dialect in years, but the sounds fell into my ears like home. Most people spend their weekends unwinding, unplugging, finding little escapes to cope with the weight of the week. I used to do that too. Long walks by the river, guilty pleasure novels, dumplings from that tiny place on Mulberry Street that reminded me of Beijing. But not anymore. After the rooftop dinner, I started spending my weekends in a different way, poring over every corner of our internal financial system, not as an employee, as a forensic observer. It began innocently. I told myself I was just checking my old reports, refamiliarizing myself with legacy data models I'd built from scratch. But that's not what I was doing. I was hunting. The files were all there, buried beneath layers of system updates and inconsistent version control. Quarterly summaries, client invoices, internal audit memos. Most people ignored the metadata. But I knew where to look. Friday night turned into Saturday morning. I brewed strong tea, pulled up my VPN, and opened a spreadsheet titled FY21 Dual Ledger VUI 3. The file name shouldn't have set off alarms, but it did, because I never created a version 3. It took me less than 20 minutes to spot the discrepancy. There were two sets of numbers, one in the visible sheet and one embedded in the cell history, only accessible if you knew how to trace rollback edits. In the original version, the quarterly report showed a 4.2% decline in leveraged returns for our West Coast clients. Not ideal, but manageable. In the revised one, a neat, tidy 2.3% gain. That wasn't a correction. That was a lie. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I triple-checked the version history, and there it was. The last edit wasn't mine. It was Gary's. Date-stamped. Logged in under his admin profile. For a full 10 minutes, I just sat there, staring at the screen, trying to slow my thoughts. I didn't panic. I didn't react. I opened a new folder on my encrypted flash drive. Discrepancy logs, level 1. That night, I didn't sleep. By Sunday afternoon, I'd pulled a dozen more files. One by one, I sifted through them, combing through metadata, timestamps, formula edits. It was tedious, exhausting, but it told a clear story. Gary wasn't just shady. He was falsifying financial records. Minor tweaks at first, rounding up projections, quietly shifting risk classifications. But in Q3 of the previous year, he crossed a line. An entire loss segment from a failed private equity partnership had been redirected in the Summary tab to appear as Client-Side Contractual Restructuring. It sounded harmless. Harmless enough to fool an outside audit. But I knew the real numbers. I had the original spreadsheet buried deep in my archived files. And what Gary had done was not optimization. It was fraud. And that was when everything snapped into focus. I wasn't just training my replacement. I was the only thing standing between Gary and a full-blown financial crime. He thought I would leave quietly. He thought I would disappear without protest, just another tired woman edged out by a cheaper version in a better suit. He didn't know I'd already started building a case. Every file I reviewed, I saved. Every metadata capture, I printed and signed with timestamps. I included full chains of custody and redlined version comparisons. I cross-referenced everything with email approvals and Slack messages. I knew enough to understand. The truth isn't useful unless it's admissible. So I documented every step. I reached out to no one. Not yet. Because a real audit doesn't begin with a confrontation. It begins with silence. And Gary? Gary had no idea that the quietest person in the room was also the one writing the final report. I kept my face still. Dinner was served in courses. Gary was seated 2 seats down from Zhang, close enough to pretend status, but not close enough to command it. Between bites of seared duck and murmurs about innovation streams, I heard the shift in Gary's voice. He'd had just enough wine to relax, and he was speaking Mandarin. Poorly, he began, nodding toward me as if Zhang had asked. She's done a decent job, but honestly, she's a bit outdated. I didn't blink. He chuckled, casually stabbing at his plate. Once she finishes training the new guy, we'll fire her. Zhang didn't laugh. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. But Gary looked pleased with himself, like a man who thinks he's said something clever and strategic. That moment lasted exactly 7 seconds. That's how long it took for my world to change, because up until then, I had been suspicious, cautious, methodical. But this was confirmation. They weren't grooming Sam to support me. They were using me to groom him, and they assumed I wouldn't understand. They had no idea I studied finance in China, that I'd written my graduate thesis in Mandarin, that I'd spent 2 years navigating the same boardroom dialect Gary had just butchered. The irony was almost poetic. I took a sip of my wine, letting the bitterness spread across my tongue. My eyes didn't flinch, my breath didn't hitch, but something inside me shifted, permanently. They thought they were being clever, hiding strategy behind language. They didn't realize they'd just handed me the weapon. For the rest of the evening, I was perfect. I laughed softly when expected, nodded at Zhang's comments, made pleasant small talk with the director of operations. I played the role of the content, compliant senior analyst. But in my head, I was rewriting the playbook. The next morning, I added a new section to my private folder. I labeled it Mandarin Transcript, Termination Plot. I wrote down everything, word for word, phonetics, context, expression. I even noted the timestamp and seating arrangement. I didn't know yet how I would use it, but I knew I would. And that was enough. Because when you work in finance long enough, you learn that leverage isn't just about money. It's about timing. And I was done waiting for mine. By the time I'd compiled my 3rd folder of discrepancies, it was clear. I couldn't take this hire through normal channels. Not HR, not legal. Gary had too many friends in the wrong places, too many vague favors and performance reviews that smelled like pre-written exonerations. But there was one person, someone no one at our branch ever really paid attention to, because she moved quietly, gracefully, and always stayed just outside the spotlight. Maya. Officially, she was listed as executive assistant to CEO Zhang, but anyone who'd worked in our Japanese office, or had ears, knew she was far more than that. Maya had been a key operations strategist in Tokyo before she was reassigned to New York. That's how our company worked. When someone was too competent to fire, but too dangerous to let roam free, they were moved closer to the top. Somewhere they could be watched. I knew she spoke fluent Japanese, Mandarin, and English. I also knew she didn't like Gary. A few years ago, I'd heard a rumor, just a whisper, that Gary once tried to have Maya written up for mismanaging executive communications after she refused to reroute a confidential memo to him. Zhang had overridden it personally. Maya stayed. Since then, Gary had never spoken to her unless absolutely necessary. That was all I needed. Late Sunday night, I drafted an email. Subject: Personal request, encrypted. Hi Maya, I hope this finds you well. I'm reaching out regarding a set of operational inconsistencies I've discovered during portfolio audits. Given your past oversight experience with Tokyo compliance, I believe you are the right person to review the materials. Would you be available for a private video sync using company encrypted protocol Alpha 6? I have a secure node set up for visual data transfer. Best, Anastasia V. I expected to wait. Maybe a day, maybe longer. Her reply came within the hour. I'll connect at 23:30 EST. Use the protocol link provided. No recordings. My heart thumped quietly against my ribs as I lit a single desk lamp and logged into the secure channel. The screen flickered twice, then steadied. Maya's face appeared, calm, unreadable. She wore no makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, effortless bun. Behind her was a wall of file boxes and an orchid that had bloomed out of season. I didn't waste time. I opened the screen share and showed her the side-by-side reports, the falsified Q3 summaries, the metadata log from the corrected revenue sheet, Gary's login activity. I spoke in clear, neutral terms, just facts, no emotion, no speculation. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, I stopped the feed and sat still. The silence stretched. Maya didn't nod. She didn't smile, but she tilted her head slightly. Her eyes, sharp and still, stayed locked on mine. Then she said softly, in Japanese, "You haven't shown this to anyone else, have you?" I responded in the same language. "No, you're the first." Another silence. Then, "Continue." I uploaded the encrypted folder into the joint relay box we agreed on during the call. She watched the progress bar silently, and just before disconnecting, she said one more thing, this time in Mandarin. "He thinks you can't see, but we, are watching." The screen went dark. I sat back in my chair, the only light in my apartment flickering against the windows. Something had shifted. This wasn't just my fight anymore. Now it was ours. And Gary? Gary had no idea that the noose was already tightening, one silent keystroke at a time. Tuesday morning began like a bad punchline. I was halfway through my fourth client forecast report when a meeting invite popped onto my screen with the emotional subtlety of a car crash. Subject: Project Titan. Ownership transition. From Gary Levins. Attendees: Sam W. Leadership Review Team: Anastasia V. Optional. Optional. The project in question? Titan, the analytics and risk modeling framework I'd spent the last 4 years building from scratch. The one I had coded in pieces during 3 a.m. coffee binges, through holidays, sick days, and system crashes. The one that had quietly reduced departmental redundancies by 18% last year. And now, according to this invite, it was being transitioned to Sam. No warning, no explanation, just passed off like a stapler. I didn't attend the meeting. I didn't need to, because 10 minutes later, a company-wide email went out from Gary's desk. Pleased to announce that Project Titan will now be overseen by Sam Weston. We're excited to see where his fresh perspective takes the initiative. Attached is a breakdown of Titan's development milestones under my leadership. Please review for alignment. I sat in stunned silence as the words burned on the screen. Under his leadership. Attached to the message was a 7-page document, glossy and over-designed, tracing the alleged evolution of Titan. My name wasn't mentioned once. But the kicker? I recognized the template. I had created it. Specifically, I designed that template 3 years ago for internal performance reviews, with a hidden metadata signature embedded in the XML layer. A signature no one but me knew about. I opened the file. Scrolled slowly. There it was. Page 4. A list of project phases that Gary claimed to have initiated himself. The language was eerily familiar, because it was mine. Copy-pasted from one of my earlier drafts, down to the phrase multi-phase compliance recalibration. The document was a forgery, not in the crude criminal sense, but in the careful corporate one. Theft disguised as attribution, plagiarism in a tailored suit. But what Gary didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the version he attached wasn't just forged, it was rigged. I had once programmed that template to flag unauthorized reuse with an invisible watermark. If copied without administrative credentials, the document would silently register the action and tag it with the user's ID, timestamp, and device signature, like a tripwire in plain sight. I activated the reader log, extracted the hidden tag, and smiled. Everything I needed, every detail, was right there, logged, recorded, legally bulletproof. I compiled the file, attached the metadata reader output, and uploaded it to the secure Maya relay. No explanation, just a folder titled Project Titan, Credit Fraud, GLV2, confirmed. Then I sat back, folded my hands, and let the email keep circulating. Gary thought he'd buried me under bureaucracy. He didn't realize he'd just signed a confession in a language he never learned to read. And Sam? Poor, eager Sam. He thought he was inheriting a legacy. What he didn't know was that he'd just been handed a grenade. There's a kind of peace that comes after the worst happens, not because you've given up, but because you've prepared. By the time the Resource Optimization Initiative email hit my inbox, I was already finished. The subject line was cold, clinical, like it had been A/B tested for minimal panic. Subject, Staff Realignment, Q3 Strategic Direction, Sender. Corporate Ops, inside, was the standard jargon, shifting priorities, a leaner model, and, buried at the bottom, a limited number of roles, including those with overlapping responsibilities, will be sunset. Transition documentation and next step support will be provided. I didn't need to scroll to see the attached list, but I did anyway. Alphabetical. There it was, just above another name I didn't recognize. Valerikova, Anastasia. Risk and Strategic Analysis. No pretense, no call, just my name, Sunset. I stared at it for 3 seconds. Then I closed the tab, because my work was already done. That morning, before the notice went out, I uploaded the final version of the dossier. I had titled it simply, Levin's Compliance, Violations, Master PDF. It was 78 pages long. Every falsified report, every unauthorized document edit, every Slack message where he coerced changes under vague language like, just fix it quietly, screen captures, revision logs, access chains, with clear annotations and legal footnotes. Each section began with a short summary, written in neutral language but sharp as glass. I knew the compliance team wouldn't care about tone. They cared about evidence, and I had delivered it like a clean scalpel. The final page was a table. It listed every document Gary had submitted as lead architect or project initiator over the last 18 months, and beside each, a column noting the true creator. Over 90% of the work attributed to him had originated from other people. My name appeared most frequently. I added one final detail before sealing the file, a timeline of Titan's creation, with visual overlays showing the quiet extraction of credit as it was happening. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even illegal. It was just indisputable. And at the bottom, a brief note to Maya. As of submission, I consider this matter closed. Thank you for seeing what others chose to ignore. I didn't need thanks. I didn't need validation. I just needed it on record. When I walked into the office that morning, no one looked me in the eye. Word had already spread. Optimization, restructure, whatever euphemism they were using now to soften theft. Sam avoided me entirely. Couldn't even meet my gaze in the hallway. Gary wasn't in yet. Maybe he'd come in late, smug and grinning, like he always did when he thought he'd pulled off something clever. That was fine. He'd see it soon enough. By noon, the dossier would be sitting on the desks of Zhang's compliance team, legal counsel, and 2 external audit firms, all forwarded by Maya. No attribution, no emotional framing, just truth, documented, verifiable, and silent. I packed my desk quietly. Just a few things, a framed photo, my notebook, the jade bracelet my mother gave me before I left for China. The rest could stay. It didn't matter. because they could delete my name from the payroll, but they couldn't erase what I'd left behind. And Gary? He had no idea what was coming next. They chose the 33rd floor conference room, the one with the glass walls, skyline views, and a conference table long enough to host a UN summit. Gary loved this room. He called it his war table, fitting in retrospect. He was already standing at the front when I walked in, wearing his favorite smirk and a navy suit that screamed overcompensation. On the wall behind him, a presentation titled Strategic Realignment, a Vision for Q3 and Beyond. As the room filled with department heads, analysts, and 2 board observers, I took a seat in the back corner. No laptop, no notes, just silence. I had nothing to prepare. My work was already done. Gary clicked his remote and launched into his speech. "Thanks for joining us," he said. "As we pivot into a more agile structure, certain roles are being reassessed. This isn't a reduction, this is an optimization." His voice was confident, arrogant even. He paused dramatically. "We've identified several redundancies that—" The door opened. Quietly, precisely, Maya stepped into the room with a black folder in her hands. Her presence changed the air like a shift in barometric pressure. Gary stuttered mid-sentence. "Maya," he said, awkwardly forced smile forming. "This isn't really your domain." She didn't respond. She walked straight past him and placed the folder in front of Mr. Zhang, who had been sitting silently at the far end of the table. Zhang opened it without a word and began to read. Gary looked uncomfortable now. "As I was saying," Zhang raised a single hand. Gary went silent, like he'd been switched off. Zhang spoke, calmly, in Mandarin. 在第47页，你生成为 Titan 项目创建了这张表格，你能解释一下 B13单元格的公式逻辑吗? On page 47, you claim to have created this spreadsheet for the Titan project. Can you explain the formula logic in cell B13? Gary blinked. I'd have to reference the original doc. Zhang looked up. This is the original document. Someone passed Gary a printed copy. He stared at it like it was a bomb wired to his chest. He fumbled. These formulas were collaboratively developed. I didn't personally. Zhang remained silent. Maya stepped forward, opening her own folder. Over the last 14 months, she said in crisp, fluent English, Gary Levins has repeatedly falsified project authorship, fabricated performance documents, and stolen intellectual work from multiple employees. The attached dossier includes version histories, server access logs, and metadata from every document he claimed as his own. She glanced briefly at the board members. In addition, we've identified multiple unauthorized file edits that concealed financial discrepancies, specifically in Q3 reporting. These actions directly misled both leadership and shareholders. Gary turned pale. Wait a second. This is insane. Who even wrote this? Maya's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. 张总裁亲自审查了所有资料，他已经签署了初步调查命令。President Zhang personally reviewed all materials. He has signed an order for preliminary investigation. Mr. Zhang finally closed the folder. Effective immediately, he said in English now. Mr. Levins is relieved of all duties and placed on administrative leave pending a full external audit. There was no outburst, no protest, just Gary's confused, crumbling expression as security stepped into the room. He looked around, desperate for an ally. His eyes stopped on me, and that's when it hit him. Too late. The woman he thought was invisible had just signed his professional obituary. I didn't smile. I didn't blink. Because this wasn't revenge. It was justice. And Gary? Gary was just the first. Silence weighed down the room like humidity before a storm. Mr. Zhang had just spoken the words that removed Gary from power. But Gary wasn't done yet. Not in his head. He stepped forward, hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected applause, not an audit. This is a coordinated attack, he said, voice cracking. I'm being targeted. It's personal, fabricated. You're going to take the word of some mid-level analyst over a senior executive with— Zhang didn't move. His face was unreadable. Gary pointed toward the back of the room. "This is her, isn't it?" he spat. "Anastasia. She's been undermining me from day one. She created this entire conspiracy. Look at the timing, the files, the metadata. You think that stuff can't be forged?" His voice was rising now, unprofessional, panicked. Maya didn't flinch. I stood up slowly from my chair. All eyes turned toward me, and I didn't hesitate. I looked Gary directly in the eyes and said, in calm, measured Mandarin, "You forgot. I know this language better than you know your job." Gasps flickered around the room like small sparks. Someone dropped their pen. Gary's mouth fell open. He looked stunned, like someone had pulled the floor out from beneath him, and he was still pretending he could stand. He had spent months assuming I was blind, deaf, and safely ignorant. And now he knew. He had been outplayed in a language he thought was his shield. No one spoke. No one defended him. Even the board liaison, who had kept a tight jaw the whole time, closed his notebook and looked away. Mr. Zhang didn't say another word. Maya made a small motion with her hand. Two members of corporate security stepped forward. They didn't touch Gary, just stood there, calm, firm, present. Gary looked around one last time. No one made eye contact. He straightened his jacket, but his shoulders slumped and his swagger had disappeared. He walked out quietly, escorted by the silence he had earned. The door clicked shut. The room exhaled. I remained standing, not triumphant, not smug, just finished, because justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers fluently, and this time it had spoken in perfect Chinese. For a few seconds after the door clicked shut behind Gary, the room remained frozen. No one moved. No one dared to speak. You could feel the pressure settling, something between shock and relief, like the moment after a storm when you're not sure if it's really over. Then Maya stepped forward, with her usual calm. Only now, her authority was undeniable. "Effective immediately," she said, her voice steady and measured. "The structure of this division will be realigned under direct oversight from the Beijing Executive Office." A subtle shift in posture swept through the room. Everyone straightened, listening more closely now. "This wasn't just a procedural update," she continued. "A new director of financial systems has been appointed. Someone with a documented track record of precision, integrity, and results." I knew what was coming, but I didn't move. Maya turned toward me with a small, respectful nod. "Anastasia Valerikova," she said, her voice carrying no embellishment, just certainty. "Effective as of today, you are the new director of financial systems for the North American division." A hush fell over the room. Some eyes widened. Others dropped. A few glanced around as if trying to remember how many times they dismissed me, underestimated me, spoken over me in meetings. Maya held up a sleek gray folder, the formal letter of appointment. "She signed the contract 2 weeks ago," she added, "pending completion of the internal audit." The contract. It had sat in my apartment drawer, inked and sealed, waiting for this day. I hadn't told anyone, because victory for me was never about announcement. It was about precision, execution, control. Mr. Zhang stood. He didn't speak, but he bowed his head slightly. Not a deep bow, not a public display, but enough. The kind of gesture only those who understand hierarchy, honor, and long games would recognize. I returned the bow, just as subtly. Then I stood, slowly, and gathered my things. I didn't give a speech. I didn't thank the room. I didn't look around for approval, because I didn't need to. The same people who once saw me as obsolete were now trying to recalculate their roles in my story. But I wasn't carrying grudges. I didn't need revenge. I'd written my own chapter, quietly, deliberately, and without ever asking permission. I walked to the door without a single comment. The conference room behind me remained silent. Not from confusion, but from respect. Let them absorb it. Let them remember the woman who never raised her voice, never played dirty, never demanded the spotlight, and still came out standing. Outside the room, the air felt lighter. The city skyline looked sharper. This wasn't the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a legacy. And this time, no one would take my name off the work.